For decades, Americans were told a simple story. The United States is the dominant power in North America, and Mexico is the junior partner, useful primarily for cheap labor and cheaper imports. But that story is not just outdated, it's dangerously misleading. Behind the headlines, behind the talk about border security, migration, and diplomatic tensions, something far more consequential has been happening. Mexico has quietly become one of the most strategically important economic pillars of the United States. And now, for the first time in modern history, Mexico holds real leverage powerful enough to shake the U.S. economy in ways most Americans aren't prepared for. To understand what's happening, you have to ignore the political noise and look at the numbers. The United States depends on Mexico more than any other trade partner in the world. Not China, not Canada, Mexico. In 2024, Mexico surpassed both countries and became the top exporter to the U.S., accounting for more than 15% of all American imports. But this isn't about avocados, tequila, or passenger cars. This is about something much deeper. Mexico has become the hidden backbone of U.S. manufacturing. Electronics, auto parts, pharmaceuticals, aerospace components, products Americans assume are made domestically, are often assembled or fully produced in Mexico. U.S. corporations moved south chasing lower labor costs, but they accidentally created something they didn't intend: structural dependency. Entire supply chains now function only because Mexico functions. A disruption at a single border crossing, a strike at a Mexican plant, or a policy shift in Mexico City can freeze production lines in Texas, Michigan, and California within days. And Mexico knows this. That's the part of the story most people missed. While American politicians focused on walls and immigration speeches, Mexico spent the last 15 years transforming itself from a low-cost assembly hub into a diversified economic force. It upgraded infrastructure, attracted global investment, expanded its energy sector, modernized manufacturing, and most importantly, used the USMCA agreement to lock in its strategic position. What began as a cost-saving decision for U.S. corporations has become a long-term strategic advantage for Mexico. The key moment was the transition from NAFTA to USMCA. When NAFTA was first enacted in 1994, it unleashed a massive industrial shift. American factories moved to Monterrey, Guadalajara, and Tijuana, leaving behind empty warehouses in states like Ohio, Wisconsin, and Michigan. By the time USMCA replaced NAFTA in 2020, the relocation was irreversible. U.S. corporations had invested too much. Millions of American jobs depended on Mexican production. The supply chains were deeply integrated. Mexico wasn't the sidekick anymore, it was a critical node. Now, Mexico is beginning to use that leverage. The country is no longer satisfied with being the cheap labor engine of North America. Wages in Mexico have risen steadily for years. Mexican unions are gaining strength. Labor reforms are forcing companies to raise standards. Environmental movements are challenging the industries that once treated Mexico as a dumping ground. These internal pressures are redefining Mexico's role and raising costs for American corporations that depended on the old model. And that's just the beginning. Mexico is also reshaping its energy sector. For decades, it served primarily as an oil supplier to the U.S., but in the last 5 years, Mexico has started asserting sovereignty over its natural resources, tightening regulations, reviewing contracts, and pushing for national control over oil, gas, and renewables. American firms that used to extract Mexican energy with little scrutiny now face a drastically different environment. If Mexico decides to prioritize domestic energy supply instead of exports, the U.S. will feel the impact immediately, especially in states dependent on imported crude. Combine this with Mexico's rapidly expanding solar and wind potential, and the balance of power shifts even further. Mexico is not just a cheap factory anymore, it's a rising energy power. The final ingredient in this transformation is geopolitical timing. As the US and China face the most intense trade conflict in decades, global companies are fleeing China and looking for alternatives. Where are they going? Mexico. Nearshoring has turned the country into the preferred destination for supply chains escaping Asia. This isn't a temporary trend. This is the future of manufacturing. So here is the uncomfortable truth. While Americans have been told that Mexico depends on the United States, the reality is now a two-way dependency, and the U.S. may be far more vulnerable than it realizes. Because if Mexico chooses to assert its leverage, if Mexico chooses to tighten control over energy, if Mexico uses labor or environmental policy to pressure foreign corporations, if Mexico decides to renegotiate terms inside USMCA, or if a political fracture emerges between the two countries, the U.S. economy could feel the shockwaves almost instantly. And that's where the secret deal comes in, a shift that Washington didn't announce, corporations don't want to talk about, and the media barely understands. As Mexico deepens its strategic position, a second layer of leverage begins to surface, one that Washington underestimated for decades. The migration debate, often portrayed as a political or security issue, is actually rooted in an economic imbalance created by the United States itself. For years, American agricultural policy flooded Mexico with subsidized corn, wheat, and soy. These products, heavily supported by U.S. taxpayers, entered the Mexican market at prices local farmers could never match. Entire rural communities collapsed. Small-scale producers who once fed their regions were forced out of business, creating a cycle of displacement that eventually pushed workers north. This wasn't an accident. It was a structural effect of NAFTA. While American consumers benefited from cheaper imports, Mexico paid the price with millions of displaced rural workers. At the same time, U.S. corporations moved factories south to cut labor costs, offering low wages and few protections. This dual pressure created an economic trap that reshaped society on both sides of the border. The United States complains about migration, but the conditions driving it were built into its own trade strategy. Now Mexico is no longer willing to carry that burden quietly. Labor movements across the country have grown stronger, demanding higher wages, better working conditions, and enforcement of labor laws that were long ignored. These movements are not isolated. They align with Mexico's broader goal of redefining its role in North America. When Mexican workers organize, entire U.S. supply chains face pressure. Strikes in one region can halt production of electronics, automotive components, or medical supplies destined for American shelves. The cheap labor model that once benefited U.S. corporations is eroding, and with it goes one of Washington's most reliable economic advantages. Energy adds a second pressure point. Mexico's push for sovereignty over oil and gas is no longer theoretical. It is reshaping the regional energy landscape in real time. U.S. refiners rely heavily on Mexican crude, more than 700,000 barrels per day, according to 2024 trade data. Any disruption, whether through national policy shifts, refinery upgrades, or prioritization of domestic supply, can force the U.S. to turn to more expensive producers. This would elevate prices for American consumers and increase vulnerability at a moment when global markets are already strained. At the same time, Mexico's renewable energy growth gives it leverage beyond traditional oil politics. Vast solar corridors in Sonora and wind corridors in Oaxaca position Mexico as a future powerhouse in clean energy. If Mexico chooses to direct this energy toward its own industries instead of exporting it, U.S. manufacturers depending on stable electricity prices could face additional shocks. A country once seen as an auxiliary producer is transforming into an energy gatekeeper. These shifts are amplified by geopolitical timing. As tensions between Washington and Beijing intensify, Mexico has become the primary beneficiary of supply chains leaving China. Global corporations that once relied on Shenzhen or Guangzhou now choose Monterrey, Saltillo, and Querétaro. This influx of investment gives Mexico new bargaining power not only with the U.S., but with Asia and Europe as well. Japan, South Korea, Germany, and even Chinese companies themselves are pouring billions into new factories along the border. Mexico is no longer competing for influence. It is becoming the center of a new industrial network. This structural change reveals a truth few in Washington want to acknowledge. If the U.S.-Mexico relationship cracks, the first sectors to collapse will be American ones. Auto plants in Michigan and Ohio would run out of components within days. Hospitals would face shortages of medical devices and pharmaceuticals. Electronics retailers would see stocks evaporate, and American consumers, accustomed to low prices, would confront disruptions that haven't been felt since the pandemic. The irony is that while American politicians frame Mexico as a problem to be managed, U.S. corporations understand the reality far better. They have spent decades entangling themselves in Mexican supply chains because the economics were irresistible. Now those same corporations are lobbying quietly in Washington, urging stability, warning that any diplomatic or economic confrontation with Mexico could cause a shock larger than the 2008 recession. This leads to the final, uncomfortable layer, Mexico's political awakening. The country is increasingly aware that it can influence U.S. domestic politics through economics alone. A disruption in auto production affects workers in swing states. A slowdown in agriculture affects food prices. A delay at the border affects retail, transportation, and logistics. Mexico doesn't need military power or financial dominance. Its leverage is embedded inside the U.S. economy itself. In this new landscape, the question is no longer whether Mexico depends on the United States. The question is whether the United States can function without Mexico. And with every passing year, the answer becomes more uncertain. These realities become even clearer when examining how U.S. corporations structured their modern supply chains. The shift toward Mexico wasn't just about low wages. It was about building a production system that operates on speed. U.S. automakers, electronics manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, and aerospace firms depend on just-in-time logistics. Factories hold minimal inventory, relying instead on constant deliveries from suppliers located only a few hours across the border. This system maximizes profit, but it also exposes a critical weakness. Any slowdown in Mexico, even a temporary one, sends ripple effects through the entire U.S. industrial base. This vulnerability was dramatically exposed during the pandemic when border closures caused parts shortages in less than a week. Plants in Michigan, Texas, and Tennessee halted production because shipments from Monterrey and Guadalajara were delayed by just 48 hours. That episode was a warning. Today, with supply chains even more tightly integrated, Mexico has far more leverage than most Americans recognize. Underscoring this new balance of power is Mexico's deepening role in the global semiconductor ecosystem. While Taiwan and South Korea dominate chip manufacturing, Mexico has quietly positioned itself as the assembly and testing hub for chips destined for U.S. automakers and defense suppliers. According to 2025 trade estimates, more than 35% of automotive semiconductors entering the U.S. now pass through facilities in Mexico. If Mexico were to tighten controls or prioritize domestic industries, American automakers, already struggling with labor strikes and EV investment shortfalls, would face severe production crises. These industrial dependencies are reinforced by demographic realities. Unlike the U.S., Mexico has a young and expanding workforce. American companies aren't just relocating factories south, they're relocating futures. While the U.S. faces a shrinking pool of skilled industrial workers, Mexico's labor force continues to expand. Companies like Tesla, Samsung, and Lockheed Martin aren't investing in Mexico because it's convenient. They're moving because the U.S. can no longer supply enough workers for large-scale manufacturing. That trend gives Mexico structural importance the U.S. cannot easily replace. The political dimension is equally significant. Under the USMCA, Mexico gained protections and negotiation mechanisms that didn't exist under NAFTA. Labor violations, environmental disputes, and tariff disagreements can now be escalated directly to international panels, and Mexico has begun to use these tools aggressively. In 2024 and 2025, Mexican officials filed multiple complaints against U.S. agricultural and energy practices, cases that forced Washington to retreat or renegotiate policies. This marks a profound shift. Mexico has become more assertive, more confident, and far more willing to challenge American dominance openly. Energy remains the area where this growing confidence is most visible. Mexico's strategy is no longer merely defensive. Instead, it is centered on shaping the future of North American energy. The government is expanding refining capacity, pushing for domestic petrochemical production, and limiting foreign participation in strategic fields. For decades, the U.S. assumed Mexico would remain dependent on American fuel and technology. But recent investments in refineries like Dos Bocas, along with partnerships in LNG, solar, and wind, are reversing that dependence. Mexico is beginning to dictate the terms of energy cooperation. This shift intersects with U.S. electoral politics in ways few analysts consider. Manufacturing jobs in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Ohio, all decisive swing states, depend on uninterrupted Mexican production. Any friction between Washington and Mexico has direct consequences for election outcomes. Political consultants understand that a supply chain disruption caused by tariffs, labor disputes, or diplomatic conflict could alter the political landscape overnight. Mexico may not intend to influence U.S. elections, but the structure of modern industry makes it inevitable. Adding to the pressure is Mexico's deepening involvement with Asia. As geopolitical tensions push companies to reduce reliance on China, Mexico has become the preferred landing zone for China Plus One strategies. Chinese firms themselves are establishing operations in Mexico to bypass U.S. tariffs while maintaining access to the American market. This blurs economic borders and creates a reality Washington is uncomfortable admitting. Some of the Mexican imports fueling the U.S. economy are, in essence, repackaged Chinese production. In this environment, Mexico is not just a trade partner. It is a gatekeeper for America's economic resilience. It can slow the flow of critical components, redirect investments, or negotiate better terms, and the impact is felt almost immediately across the U.S. economy. Mexico's leaders increasingly understand this. Washington does too. But the American public has not yet fully realized how much of the country's economic stability depends on decisions made in Mexico City. The next phase of this shift is already emerging. As wages rise in Mexico, the old model of cheap labor is fading. Companies will face a choice: accept higher production costs or move operations again. But the U.S. has limited alternatives. Central America lacks Mexico's infrastructure. Asia is too distant for the U.S. nearshoring model. Even American manufacturing hubs cannot compete with Mexico's speed, workforce size, or geographic advantage. This convergence of factors, labor, energy, geopolitics, supply chains, means one thing: Mexico's leverage over the U.S. is not temporary. It is
A
structural,
todos. Eu só
accelerating,
queria
and
lembrar que o
deeply
seu
embedded
voto
in
é
the mechanics of
importante
the
este ano.
global economy.
Certifique-se de se
The
inscrever
United
antes do
States may
prazo
not
final.
acknowledge
É
it
fundamental que
publicly,
todos os
but
cidadãos
privately,
participem do
its
processo eleitoral.
policymakers and
O voto
corporations
consciente
know
é
the
a base da
truth.
nossa democracia
If
e garante a
Mexico shifts
legitimidade dos
direction,
resultados.
even slightly, the consequences for America would be immediate and severe. This structural leverage becomes even more evident when examining North America's manufacturing map. For decades, the United States assumed it could simply bring jobs back home whenever it became politically necessary. But the truth is far more complex. Rebuilding industrial capacity is not a switch a country can flip on command. It requires trained workers, reliable infrastructure, competitive energy costs, and long-term investment cycles. Mexico, through steady development, now possesses all four components. The U.S., in contrast, faces shortages in each category. This imbalance is why nearshoring to Mexico has accelerated rather than slowed, even as American politicians promise domestic revitalization. The auto industry illustrates this dynamic perfectly. The U.S. once produced the majority of its own vehicles. Today, Mexico manufactures more cars for the American market than Michigan. This includes not only assembly, but the intricate web of components, transmissions, wiring harnesses, semiconductor modules that make modern vehicles operational. According to 2025 projections, over 38% of U.S. auto parts imports originate from Mexico, a figure that continues to climb. Any disruption in Mexico's industrial corridor would immediately stall U.S. automotive production, triggering price increases and supply shortages across the country. Pharmaceuticals tell a similar story. The U.S. depends on Mexico for essential drug components, including antibiotics, medical-grade plastics, and packaging materials. This dependency remains mostly hidden from the public, but it is deeply understood within Washington. A regulatory shift or export adjustment in Mexico could disrupt U.S. hospitals within weeks. Mexico's position is no longer that of a supplementary supplier. It has become a central pillar of American healthcare logistics. Energy transport further reinforces this bind. The U.S. imports millions of barrels of refined fuel from Mexico annually, and the two nations share critical pipeline infrastructure. The more Mexico pushes toward energy sovereignty, controlling its refineries, prioritizing domestic needs, and tightening foreign participation, the more the U.S. must adjust its energy strategy. Any changes Mexico makes, whether in regulation, pricing, or output allocation, ripple directly into U.S. energy markets. These interdependencies create an environment in which U.S. political decisions can no longer be made in isolation. Tariffs, border policies, and regulatory shifts now carry a cost that extends far beyond political messaging. A tariff dispute, for instance, no longer simply impacts trade. It disrupts essential industries and risks destabilizing entire sectors of the U.S. economy. Mexico understands this, and it has begun to negotiate from a position of strength rather than concession. What magnifies this leverage even further is Mexico's emergence as a geopolitical crossroads. As tensions grow between Washington and Beijing, multinational corporations are restructuring their global operations. Mexico, benefiting from proximity and USMCA protections, has become a prime destination for investment redirected from China. This isn't just opportunistic. It transforms Mexico into a bridge between Asian manufacturing and American consumption. Chinese, Korean and Japanese firms are all expanding operations in cities like Querétaro, Saltillo, and Tijuana. These companies depend on Mexico to maintain U.S. market access, which in turn deepens Mexico's influence over regional supply chains. Simultaneously, Mexico is expanding partnerships outside North America. Increased collaboration with South American economies, coordination with European energy firms, and alignment with Asia's advanced manufacturing networks are giving Mexico additional bargaining power. The U.S. can no longer assume automatic alignment. In certain negotiations, especially regarding labor, agriculture, and energy, Mexico now behaves more like a peer state than a dependent partner. These developments reshape the fundamental question confronting both nations. What happens if interests diverge? For the U.S., the consequences would be swift and tangible. A slowdown in auto production, delays in electronics assembly, medical supply shortages, higher fuel prices, longer delivery times, political fallout in key swing states. Mexico's influence is not theoretical. It is woven into the daily functioning of the American economy. Still, Mexico faces its own uncertainty. The transition toward higher wages and stronger labor protections could challenge its competitive edge. Domestic politics may shift priorities in unexpected ways. Energy reforms could create friction with foreign investors. Environmental requirements may slow manufacturing expansion. Yet even with these risks, Mexico's long-term trajectory points toward increasing economic assertiveness. Its geographic advantage, demographic strength, and industrial ecosystem position it as an essential counterpart, not a subordinate. For American policymakers, this new reality demands a recalibrated approach. The old framework, in which Mexico served primarily as a low-cost extension of U.S. production, no longer reflects geopolitical or economic conditions. The U.S. must recognize that Mexico's leverage is structural and embedded. Cooperation must be based on mutual interest rather than unilateral expectations. The deeper truth is that North America's stability now hinges on a delicate balance. If Mexico continues asserting control over energy, manufacturing, and labor, the U.S. cannot afford confrontation. If the U.S. pushes too aggressively, through tariffs, political pressure, or restrictive border measures, it risks destabilizing the very supply chains that support its economic growth. This delicate equilibrium explains why lawmakers, corporations, and analysts are increasingly concerned about the consequences of mismanaging the U.S.-Mexico relationship. The path forward will depend on whether both nations can accept this new dynamic. For decades, the U.S. dominated North American trade, but economic gravity has shifted. Mexico's influence is no longer supplemental, it is foundational. The United States might still be the world's largest economy, but its ability to function smoothly now depends on decisions made south of the border. And as Mexico continues to recognize and wield its power, the structure of North America's future becomes far less predictable and far more consequential.